Hello everyone, welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Yet another week of fantastic fantasy sports talk. We have a fantastic week and show ahead of us to start it off. We are going to be discussing some NBA topics, specifically focusing on this rookie class and what impressed me the most from them in the Summer League. We're going to start off though with Rookie of the Year odds from the Summer League, and then we have some kind of interesting fantasy football segments kind of based off some ESPN articles I read about players set to score either more or less TDs for the upcoming season. As we all know, while TDs might not be the biggest indication of whether or not you have drafted a fantasy star, they are still integral to the game of fantasy football, and so I thought it would be very interesting to go over this article and present you with some evidence of my own based off of that. And then we also have one little IDP player profile at the end of the show about a guy who really does not seem to get the respect he deserves because he might be one of the better defenses in the league, if not the best defense in the league. But before we begin with any of that exciting stuff, I do want to remind you yet again to like, follow, and subscribe to the show as a whole. It is greatly appreciated by all involved. We receive a ton of tips and donations as well. So if you consider doing that, please consider leaving them at the link GSMC.cloud. Is a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and the network as a whole. Also, if you have any burning questions, comments, or concerns, you can leave them there as well, and they will be answered and addressed at the beginning of the next episode. Without further ado, let's get into a show to start off the week right. And we start off the week by looking at the rookies of the NBA class. We did this last week with the NFL a little bit. Very exciting class there, and not necessarily the same can be said about the NBA. It seems more balanced than high-level talent at the top. But if the Summer League was any indication, this proves for a very wide-open Rookie of the Year debate. All of these players, it's going to come down to who fits in what scheme, which team might overperform, because all of these rookies are on teams that might be in some kind of rebuilding effort or retooling effort, so to speak. But for now, I think that this race is very close, closer than people expect, and a lot of new candidates were able to emerge in terms of performance in the Summer League. So without further ado, let's jump right into this segment. Starting off at number 5, a guy who I think could have a say in terms of minutes for the team he's playing for. I think he would add a fresh sense of rejuvenation to this team, and that is Matas Buzelis of the Chicago Bulls. I really like him. He's very aggressive on defense. His on-ball D is spectacular. And for a Chicago Bulls team that is kind of getting up there in age, Vucevic is not going to stay there forever. DeRozan, obviously, moving on. I think that they need to focus on the youth that they have, and I think this could prove to be a fantastic pickup. This guy's had experience in Europe. At plus 900, he has good value as well. It's all going to come down to how the Bulls view their own rebuilding process. Do they think they're further along than expected because they have the older players in their squad that can help these young players? Or do they really want to focus on a youthful movement and include a guy like Buzelis in the rotation, because he averaged 20.3 points per game in the Summer League. So that just goes to show that this guy really wants to be a part of the Chicago Bulls roster and impact them heavily in a positive manner. So at plus 900, I really like this kind of pick because there's always someone in the NBA Rookie of the Year discussion who pops out of nowhere, and this could be the kid to do that. I really think that, especially on a team that's hopefully trying to create some youthful kind of manner to their play, I feel like Buzelis can be that guy. Coming in at number 4, though, is another guy who I really like because he's a pure shooter that the Lakers desperately needed. Playing in the Summer League really helped him get the experience that maybe will help him distribute the ball a little more and kind of pad his stats in that department as well. But Dalton Connect certainly feels like someone who can fit into the Lakers rotation. If there was one spot of diagnosis to improve the Los Angeles Lakers in any manner, it was pure shooting ability. They needed a guy on the perimeter to stretch the floor, and Connect can be that guy. He was perhaps the best shooter in college basketball last year, plus 900. I think that he certainly is going to be more of a rotational guy because it will highly depend on how the Lakers play. Maybe JJ Redick wants to balance the egos in the room, keep LeBron and AD comfortable while still rotating in players that he believes fills their needs as well because they're still the stars of the team. So by no means is Dalton Connect going to be a workhorse for the Los Angeles Lakers. I just think he's going to set a bar for them. I think that he's also a player that J.J. Redick might like because of his shooting. J.J. Redick was a pure shooter, and so that could carry over, and maybe he gets more minutes than people expect. But as of now, at plus 900, I view him in kind of the same tier as Buzelis, where he might not contribute right away, but when he does, it's highly valuable, and it will be nice to watch, and he's a nice little change of pace for the Los Angeles Lakers offense, especially now that you feel like LeBron is on the precipice of retiring. Perhaps changing their mindset in terms of offensive output could lead to Dalton Connect becoming the new face of this franchise. But I still think he is in that second tier of NBA rookies. Coming number 3, a guy who kind of dropped in the rankings a little bit, but I still think adds good value and length and versatility to this Atlanta Hawks team, Zachary Razakar, the number 1 overall pick at plus 800. I think this is a guy who will consistently improve as the NBA season progresses. I think that right now he has all the traits to prove why he's the number 1 overall pick. Good three-point shot for someone of his height. Good length for someone of his height. But I really think that it needs to translate to the NBA. That's the question with him. Will his game properly translate to the NBA? And now to an Atlanta Hawks team that might view him as a second option because Dejounte Murray is out of there. Trae Young definitely needs a running partner to play off of. Can Zachary Razakar really be that guy? It's going to be a lot of pressure on him as well because of the fact that this class was low level. And perhaps the Hawks could have gone out and got someone different, or maybe even traded down, as people were talking about. But as of right now, I feel like Razakar definitely is someone to keep an eye on more towards the end of the season, not at the beginning of the season, because I still feel like he's going to need to be integrated into this Atlanta Hawks team a little bit more than people would expect. But he has all the traits. He has the size, he has the length. Now it's all about putting those pieces of the puzzle together. And it's all about concentrating on getting to the best point of what he can be for the Atlanta Hawks, because he could be a valuable asset in the next 5 to 10 years for the Atlanta Hawks. But these top 2 guys really could interchange a little bit as the year goes on. Maybe they fall out of this completely because of the fact that they're mainly so solid at one facet of their game that you can really ignore some of the other facets. But coming in at number 2 is Reed Sheppard, who, outside of Dalton Connect, is probably the best shooter in terms of rookies. 20 points per game, 49% field goal percentage in the Summer League at plus 650. I think that, Reed Sheppard is going to be someone who can play minutes in this league early on, because the Houston Rockets really are a team that's trying to find ways that teammates can fit together. I don't necessarily think they have a set starting 5. So Reed Sheppard was going to find his way early and often into this rotation. That could be why he's so high. But outside of his shooting ability, there are huge question marks surrounding certain aspects of his game. Can he defend at a high level? Can he distribute the ball at a high level? And that's going to be called into question. I still like his upside as a shooter. But when I think about team fits especially, do the Houston Rockets really view him as someone who can step in and be a difference maker in every aspect of the game on the offensive and defensive side of the ball? I'm not so certain. And that's what could be holding him back. That being said, his shooting prowess could help him and lead him to high production in that scoring area, but I do need to see some improvement in other facets of his game in order for me to truly cement him as one of the top contenders for the Rookie of the Year. But at plus 650, it's kind of a nice little bet there. And if you want someone who's a pure shooter to bet on, then Shepard could be your guy. But coming in number 1 is the guy who I've been saying all along finally needs to get his flowers in terms of being in the NBA Rookie of the Year discussion. And that, of course, is the big man, Zach Edey. Now, a lot of people will question him being at number 1 in terms of contention, but at the end of the day, the one factor that I can't ignore is something that I've been thinking all along. How are you going to stop him in terms of the size he presents? He's a big body that you are forced to defend. And in that way, by being forced to defend him, it opens up so many players in the ball. He can just sit in the post, get the ball down low, and then read defenses and do whatever he wants. He can impose his will on a game in many ways, and even though you can kind of fault him because he's so big, he's kind of a liability on defense, you still have to compensate for what he brings to the court. There's no way around him. You can't just ignore the fact that there's a 7'6" or so guy in the middle of the paint who could either score at will or distribute the ball because you're dropping onto him and you're just opening up shooters around him. That's what Zach Edey presents, and that's why I really like the fact that he's now the number 1 contender for the Rookie of the Year, because you just cannot ignore him. He's a player who's going to have his way in certain moments, and therefore he should and will deserve to sit atop the Rookie of the Year ladder when all is said and done. But that should just about do it for this segment. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Coming next, we have an interesting segment, like I said, based off an ESPN article about players who are set to score more or less touchdowns. We'll be right back to talk about those on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you yet again that if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is greatly appreciated by all at the network. And also, you can leave any questions, comments, or concerns that will be addressed at the beginning of the next episode. Without further ado, let's jump right into what should be an interesting segment based off an article I found on ESPN about players who are set to score more touchdowns than expected in the 24-25 NFL season. Now, like I said at the start of the show, touchdowns are not as highly coveted as a stat in fantasy football. You're concerned about a lot more things than just touchdowns and whether people score. It's yardage, reception, stuff like that. But at the end of the day, touchdowns are very highly valued in fantasy football. So you're always looking for that guy who is going to break out in that department. And these guys that I compiled from the ESPN, looking at their stats and how they can improve really prove the point that when all is said and done, you need either a good wide receiver or a tight end to really generate points in whatever ways they can. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off with a guy, no surprise being on this list. He's had inconsistent quarterback play and still managing to put up 1,000-yard seasons. Garrett Wilson finally gets, at the very least, a competent quarterback in Aaron Rodgers. Who knows if he's going to be serviceable enough at his age to really propel the Jets into serious contention. It could happen. I still believe in this offense. I don't think Aaron Rodgers will definitely have to do too much to get this offense up to speed, but it's definitely something that I'm going to have to monitor as the season goes on. I'm going to fully trust him. But then again, Garrett Wilson has had it much worse at the quarterback position. He's had the likes of Zach Wilson, Tim Boyle, and Trevor Siemian throw him the football, and he still has put up numbers. That being said, not very high in the touchdown department. He's projected to have 9 touchdown passes this season, even though he was limited to 7 red zone targets last year. And so, I feel like Garrett Wilson is one of those wide receivers who can really help you anywhere on the field, whether it's an open space, whether it's in the red zone. Like I said, if he gets red zone targets, I really think that number will skyrocket for him, and he's going to be a very coveted fantasy player if that happens. But you just need to get him the ball in order for him to truly shine. And even when Zach Wilson, Tim Boyle, and Trevor Siemian did it, we saw what he could do. Aaron Rodgers, I feel like, opens up a lot more avenues. We're going to have to see how many avenues that is, because who knows what his deep ball looks like, who knows what his short to intermediate routes look like at the current moment. But Garrett Wilson's definitely a huge help. He's unlike any receiver that I believe Aaron Rodgers has had before. I think that Aaron Rodgers' last great receiver was Devontae Adams and that partnership. But now I feel like it's the time for Garrett Wilson's production to really get realized, for being in this team and for being a receiver that Aaron Rodgers simply cannot ignore having. And even with that inconsistent quarterback play, another intriguing stat is that he's 5th amongst wide receivers with 13 end zone targets and 122 attempts. So as you can see, that production is only set to go up. So look out for Garrett Wilson this season. Number 2 is a tight end who is definitely going to have a bigger role in this setup. Maybe not in ways that people expect, because I think this offense is going to transition to a more shorter passing game. But Dalton Kincaid certainly is now at least the number 2 option on the Buffalo Bills. 4 touchdowns projected this year. I think that he is someone who is going to sneak under the radar a little bit, because a lot of attention is not going to be placed on him, but rather how the Bills' wide receiver core and skill position core perform as a whole. So, that being said, that takes a lot of pressure off of Dalton Kincaid. He was top 10 last year in receptions and yardage. And, like I said, without Diggs, I expect this offense to get a little more varied. You still have guys like Khalil Shakir. You drafted Keon Coleman. You have a guy in Curtis Samuel who has had, at some points in his career, decent stretches. But when all is said and done, the bottom line is Dalton Kincaid is probably your best option. He knows this offense is familiar with what he has to do to improve it, and I think he's going to be a go-to target, especially in the red zone for Josh Allen. And in the grand scheme of things, I think the Bills will overperform expectations in terms of skill position production. I think that having Josh Allen is just a huge asset for any team. Having a quarterback of his caliber is a huge asset. And so that just sets up the Bills immediately for success and integration into the system. And so Dalton Kincaid is going to be a huge asset in terms of fantasy as well. And then you have a guy in Chris Godwin who was really disappointing. This is coming from personal experience. I had Godwin as one of my wide receivers last year, and there were stretches where he was really impressive, really carried the workload, and then there's some stretches where he was really absent. Maybe it's kind of the deal by having Baker coming in and him being more comfortable throwing to Mike Evans as a number one wideout. But Chris Godwin certainly is someone who disappointed in the touchdown department because he's one of the more well-rounded wide receiver 2s in the league. He's projected to have 6 touchdowns this season. He's had 83-plus catches in the past 3 seasons. All 3 seasons, 83-plus catches, but only 10 touchdowns to show for it. And so I feel like the addition of a new QB coach really will help Baker Mayfield vary the passing attack, get him back to kind of that play-action approach where more options are available to him. And that way, I feel like a lot more avenues will open up for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers offensively, because I think that even though Mike Evans is so reliable and you can't look past him, we'll talk about him later this week actually, I feel like Chris Godwin needs the respect he deserves. Because without Chris Godwin, you don't have a guy who can really trouble defenses. And so, at the end of the day, Chris Godwin is perhaps the guy who has the most to prove out of this list in terms of scoring. And then the last player who I wanted to highlight in this kind of segment is Zamir White. We talked about him a little bit on previous shows about how he has big shoes to fill in that Las Vegas Raiders running back room with the absence of Josh Jacobs off to Green Bay. Projected to have 6 touchdowns, and this might be wishful thinking, right? Because Zamir White is not by any means an experienced running back. First full season is perhaps the RB1 in that Raiders running room. And he really does have a lot of pressure on his shoulders because Ian O'Connell, while he definitely got the experience last year as a rookie in that Las Vegas Raiders system, Antonio Pierce really seeming to like him a lot, I still think that at the end of the day, the bottom line is Gardner Minshew is going to be the starting quarterback because he adds the most value, but he still isn't a starting quarterback who you would immediately trust in this system, and so Zamir White's definitely going to have a lot of attention on him. He's gone 1 touchdown on 136 carries. He's in the top 20 in terms of fantasy outings, 11th in points, and 21 carries and 3.3 targets over the past couple of games that he's played. And so, in that small sample size, you can see the flashes of what he can mean to this Las Vegas Raiders system, what it can mean to Antonio Pierce's coaching methods. He really wants to preach physicality and hardcore football, and Zamir White represents that. Funnily enough, though, Antonio Pierce did want Josh Jacobs to stick around, but Zamir White's going to have to be the guy. And why not Zamir White in this system? I think that a lot of people in the running back market are slowly panicking because they know that the volatility of the position in terms of fantasy is rapidly changing. It's not quite at the tight end level, I believe. It's not quite at the wide receiver yet, where there's such a good high-end upside and then a low side to it as well. So, in the running back market, I really feel like you can't ignore a guy of Zamir White's caliber. And so, out of all these players, I feel like Zamir White has the most upside. But reviewing this list, I think this is a fantastic list in terms of guys with huge opportunities. It kind of feels funny to say that Garrett Wilson is going to have more opportunities and more points to prove. But at the end of the day, he really hasn't had someone like Aaron Rodgers. And so that just adds this sense of intrigue to the Jets' offense that really wasn't there before, because no one really saw Garrett Wilson with a guy who respects him as a wide receiver 1 and really wants to get him going. And then with a guy like Kincaid, that's also kind of by nature and fate of circumstance that Dalton Kincaid is now seen as the most coveted option at the wide receiver position at the tight end position for the Buffalo Bills. He's perhaps going to be the best receiver. And then Godwin and White, similar situations where Godwin just had a very down year last year. And it might not have anything to do with him, but I still believe he still adds value to this Buccaneers system, and his ability to be that high-level wide receiver 2 that they need is going to have to come into play a bit more. And then last but not least, going over Samir White. He definitely has big shoes to fill, but I think he will fill them perfectly, and he will fit in seamlessly into the system set before him. But that should just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we transition from players who have opportunities to score more touchdowns to players who are set to score less touchdowns. That is, they had such impressive seasons last year that there's no way that people believe that they can replicate it. It should be a fascinating segment, and we will be back to discuss it on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast up next.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I hope you guys enjoyed those last couple of segments. We are sticking with this kind of theme of touchdown totals, but switching to the more negative side of things. These players had fantastic seasons last year, but I don't think they're going to replicate it. ESPN does not either. Looking at the stats, there's certainly a lot of caveats to how this will plan out, how these players will score less touchdowns than expected. And so without further ado, let's jump right into the segment. Starting off with a running back duo who really impressed last year, mainly due to their speed and their abilities in a Miami Dolphins offense that really coveted that skill set. Raheem Mostert and Devon Achane. First, let's just talk about these two very diverse players in the system, right? You have Raheem Mostert, whose game really has aged well. He's his age 32 season, but I really don't see the longevity side of it, especially as someone who is predicated himself on running fast and in having speed be the determining factor in how he performs. And then you have Achane, who's a young rookie, who was a young rookie last year, kind of came onto the scene as one of the better running backs in the league, who also is the speedster kind of back. So that's the big question about both of these guys. Like, speed is an important asset, but how important is it? Especially in a Miami Dolphins offense that isn't struggling for speed. And so all of these kind of factors seep in, and then the stats truly back it up. There's a gap between expected and actual rush yards from Mostert. Achane, also not many carries inside the 5-yard line. That's another big thing. Running backs get more highly valued the closer they are to the red zone. A lot of the big runs that Mostert and Achane broke off were very long runs where they had a lot of open field ahead of them. And so I really feel as if you should take someone like Christian McCaffrey or a Breece Hall, who's effective not just in open space, but can finish the job close in. And so Mostert and Achane really don't necessarily have that factor to them. They're not kind of close range running backs where you know they're going to score from 5 yards out. All of their production comes from the open field. And sometimes it's nice to have. Sometimes, having a guy who can break out a nice big run is effective. But at the end of the day, I feel like the running back position is where you can really covet touchdowns, because getting a nice big gain is nice, but it only gets you like first down point production in terms of fantasy. Touchdowns are much more highly coveted in terms of the running back position. And so look for you to fade Mostert and Achane once the season starts. Then you have a guy in Jalen Hurts, actually, in terms of rushing production, who, now that Saquon Barkley is in the city of brotherly love, Hurts is definitely going to have his rushing abilities come into question, especially on the brotherly shove. That's the most effective play for any quarterback in terms of not only real life but fantasy as well. And should Saquon get more touches inside the 5-yard line, as I expect that he will, Jalen Hurts and the brotherly shove could be no more. There could only be a couple during games. He still has 53 career rushing touchdowns, 15 of them last year. But a lot of that is going to come down to the balance of Jalen Hurts as a runner and Saquon Barkley as a runner, because they're two very different runners. Jalen Hurts at speed and electricity in the open field. Saquon Barkley has a bit of strength of that as well. And so, looking at the combination, it's certainly an interesting duality to see who will really carry the torch as the rusher, the lead rusher inside the 10-yard line. And I don't necessarily see Hurts as that guy anymore, because Saquon has been so effective throughout his career, whether it be in the red zone and also as a receiver in the red zone. And so, yeah, I think that Hurts is definitely going to be hurt in that department. That being said, I still think he's going to be a high-end fantasy QB because of the fact that he still has weapons that he can pass to. He just needs to pass to them effectively. And then you have another quarterback in Josh Allen, who also is going to kind of come down because the stats in terms of rushing, he actually was the one with the 53 career rushing touchdowns. Jalen Hurts has 38 rushing touchdowns over the past 3 seasons. But I feel as if Josh Allen's style of running is much more desperate than people think. I don't think Allen wants to be as much of a rushing quarterback as people expect. A lot of it just comes down to his ability to be more physical than the defender in front of him. And so, as the opportunities arise for Josh Allen, he takes them. And this year, I feel as if, that avenue is still open to him. It's definitely his worst receiving core he's had, so therefore he might not place as much trust in them as usual. But overall, I feel as if Josh Allen kind of needs to take things as they come a little bit more, because that's another big thing about him, the turnovers. You always take Josh Allen at the top end of the quarterback discussion with a grain of salt, because you know he's going to put up big stats, but you know he's going to turn the ball over. And a lot of that is stemming from how he runs the football. He's not necessarily the most protective running quarterback, You think of guys like Lamar, you think of guys like even Hurts. They protect the ball pretty well. And you can't say the same about Josh Allen. So he's going to have to become a much more risk-averse rusher and a player as a result. So therefore, his gaudy stats that he's been putting up in terms of rushing abilities should regress to the mean a little bit this year, because not only is he going to want to focus more on getting these wide receivers up to speed and really focusing on the passing game as a whole, I just think he wants to calm himself down to get out of those situations where, he feels like he has no choice to run, but to run. And then, last but not least, Javonte Williams, I believe is the player. I just wrote Williams down. Don't know why. I believe it's Javonte Williams. I feel as if Javonte Williams was one of those players last year who really overperformed because of the simplified nature of what the Denver Broncos offense became. I think that overall, he really wasn't one of those running backs who succeeded individually. I feel like it was more of a concerted effort to get the Denver Broncos offense ticking. Because without him, the Denver Broncos offense, without him being the centripetal force of the Denver Broncos offense, rather, I feel like a lot of what made Javonte Williams so good last year was that he just got a lot of touches by force and by nature. He was 16th in touches last year, 3rd in touchdowns, 6th with carries inside the 5-yard line, And so, this goes to show that the Denver Broncos offense has changed so much. Because I feel like Sean Payton last year, in terms of expanding the field for Russell Wilson, really leaned into Williams a lot more. But now that Sean Payton's got his guy in Bo Nix, who he firmly trusts and believes can lead this team in this offense, I think that Javonte Williams' production will just go down because of that aspect of it. I mean, Bo Nix certainly isn't going to hit the ground running, but Sean Payton will certainly be more reliant on him than people expect. I think that the Denver Broncos really have a solid running back room to rely upon and lean upon should Bo Nix struggle, but I feel like Sean Payton feels a little bit like Bo Nix is the next big thing, and I don't see it. And I feel like Javonte Williams shouldn't be on this list because I think that when he gets touches, he's really effective. And when he gets touches, good things happen. I think he also, more ways than one, expands it more now for Bo Nix than he did with Russell Wilson, because Russell Wilson actually had, certain traits that actually made him pop in this Denver Broncos offense. And so replacing it with Bo Nix certainly puts a wrench in how people are going to view Javonte Williams, when in fact he should be more highly coveted than people need him to be. And so at the end of the day, Javonte Williams really feels like an outlier on this list because fate of circumstance had led him to this point. And going over this list, in all reality, having these two rushing quarterbacks and then one running back room that really predicates itself on one trait, and one guy who's just kind of left by the wayside a little bit, it's really interesting to view. Because when you think about players who score less touchdowns, your mind immediately goes to running backs. But this year, this running back market is really going to become befuddling because you really don't know who and what to value and how to place that value in meaningful ways, how to balance the running backs you're looking for in fantasy. I can immediately understand why most of Achane will definitely decrease in terms of touchdown total. They're not going to have as many 60-yard touchdown runs. But when I think about Hurts and Allen and Williams, these are all guys, even though Williams is the only running back, who add so much value in terms of red zone touches, in terms of how the offense opens up for them. And so I think it's really confusing to see someone like Williams. That being said, I'm not necessarily docking any points for what ESPN thinks. This is just my own opinion coming into view of these kind of 5 players, because they're all so different in what makes them so confounding to diagnose. And so at the end of the day, the bottom line is you're going to have to pick and choose your poison in terms of the running backs and in terms of also how quarterbacks are going to be valued in terms of rushing. So at the end of the day, I think this segment was very nice to kind of dissect what to look for in terms of running backs and rushing quarterbacks in terms of touchdown value. But that will just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we go back to the NBA for a little bit and back to this rookie class. We will be assessing the Summer League in terms of fantasy. Which of these rookies is going to really step into a big role in their first year? We'll be back to discuss that on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC. to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys are enjoying the show. We are in the home stretch and we are going back to the NBA in this fascinating rookie class that's so balanced and so skillful. We are going to assess their performance in the Summer League and see how they will translate in terms of fantasy. We're going to focus on some rookies who are in the Rookie of the Year discussion and some rookies who might get there at the end of the season. Without further ado, let's jump right into this segment. Now, one thing I think a lot of people look for in Summer League is not necessarily consistency, but certain traits that will allow rookies to settle into their teams. It's all about diagnosing what your starting five weaknesses are and how you're going to add these pieces into it, these new pieces into it. And so I'm going to look at these guys in terms of what they will add value-wise first, in terms of fantasy-wise second, because that's the thing that I think a lot of people take away from Summer League. Looking at these guys through a lens of fit. Let's start off with Razaka, which we talked about for our NBA Rookie of the Year segment. He is, in my humble opinion, a guy who is going to be a quote-unquote slow burn. He's not going to immediately pop off the page as a guy who you trust from the get-go. I think he's going to need time to settle into this Atlanta Hawks team, and they don't need to rush it. I know that they kind of want to now that Dejounte Murray is gone, but at the current moment in time, you still need to understand that out of everyone in this draft class, you decide to take a flyer on Razaka, and at the end of the day, this entire class is an unfinished product, and so you have to roll with the punches here. Yes, Razaka certainly can be a star immediately, but I don't think he needs to be and wants to be. That's the main thing a lot of people are talking about. Is Razaka intent on being a star in this league? And I think that the Atlanta Hawks are going to figure out by hook or by crook, because this is kind of a now more desperate pick than people expect. Now that Dejounte Murray is gone, a lot of weight is going to be placed on his shoulders, and I don't think he's as prepared. That being said, though, I think the traits that really pop off the page is length, his versatility, good shot off the dribble, makes him an intriguing fantasy option, and I think he can go in categories, leagues, maybe even ESPN leagues, especially in the top 100 to 125 picks. I think that the value he adds really stems from him being a big man kind of in the mold of Wemby, where he has traits that he can really focus on that will make him pop, and then some traits that he needs to work on. Maybe strength to add to his size will make him a player of intrigue in the future. But right now, Razaka is certainly a number one pick with a lot more questions than answers to him. Then let's go to Reed Sheppard, because that dynamic between Reed Sheppard and the Houston Rockets is going to be an interesting one, because the Houston Rockets are still a young team trying to figure out what, if any, identity they're going to have for the future of this team. Now, like I said before, the one trait that people can pinpoint in Reed Sheppard is obviously his shooting. 52% in college, can create his own looks. And I think that Reed Sheppard, when we talk about shooters especially, when Reed Sheppard comes to mind, he's going to be someone whose shooting might not detract as much as people think from what the Houston Rockets style of play is. I kind of view him as almost a second coming of Harden in that his shooting really stretches what the Houston Rockets can do. And I think there's a lot of athleticism, raw athleticism, on the Houston Rockets that needs to be tapped into. And Reed Sheppard can kind of allow most of that Houston Rockets offense to really stand out. I like what Jalen Green does. He's a solid driver. I like Alperen Sengun as well. It's a solid kind of hybrid center forward position. And so adding shooting, yeah, might like Reed Sheppard to be something a little bit more than just a pure shooter, but it could be effective. And so I think he might be a top 100 pick as well in fantasy because of his ability off the bench perhaps to shoot the lights out. And so Reed Sheppard is someone who you might want to consider, but might need to develop, much like Razaker, in the ways he can improve upon what he's doing already. And then, last but not least, let's look at a player who we didn't necessarily mention in terms of this summer league and this rookie class. How about Donovan Clingan? He kind of got lost in the mix. He's another one of those big guys who is going to have a lot of stats you might covet a lot in fantasy as well. He's a guy you might have to pay some attention to. He led the summer league in blocks, rebounding. So, as you can see, maybe in the center position where, points are certainly going to be at a premium outside of, unusual stats. There are only a few centers in the league who you can really rely upon as number one options, the Jokic's and Embiid's of the world. But in a league where big men are really transitioning into the next big thing, Donovan Clingan is kind of anomalous because I think that the center evolution is highly predicated on how these centers are scoring. And when I think about Donovan Clingan, he can score the bucket, sure. But what I love about him is he's so keyed in defensively that you have to compensate for the size and strength he brings on the defensive side of the ball. That being said, the minutes are a concern. It leaves on the Portland Trailblazers where, they have a nice little mix of centers that they want to play. But I think that Donovan Clingan is more of a categories lead guy. And the reason being is that obviously categories, especially in rebounds and blocks, are going to be very important. So if you can get those weird stats, then you might be all set in terms of that department. But Donovan Clingan is certainly in a situation where he might not be as highly coveted as other options in this system. But the overarching sentiment thinking about this rookie class is that these are unfinished products. These are guys who, at the end of the day, are going to need to grow into what these teams think about them. And it really was a weird kind of lottery draft because you had teams at the top of the lottery that are more in retooling mode than full-on rebuild. Like, take the Hawks, for example. Everyone knew that they were going to give up at least one of their players, right? But they still have Trae Young. And if they truly believe in Razaker's skill set and believe that he can add more value and upside than a Dejounte Murray, then they felt like this is the draft where they just had to pick the best value for their team image in the future. And then from there, it really just opened up the best available fit. This felt like a very kind of best available, kind of by the book approach to this draft class. And who knows? Maybe this draft class is getting a little bit underrespected, underappreciated, But that just goes to show that the league is ever changing. It's going to be very difficult for these young players to really find a place early and often to fit into this team. That's why assessing Summer League is so difficult, especially because you just want to see players' true traits shine. And when you've been watching and scouting these kids for such a long time, it really comes down to the fact of the matter being, well, how is my team going to improve? Should I go out and get this guy? And at the end of the day, when I talk about these guys who have so much room for improvement, but still have ways that they could and should affect their teams positively, I think that in fantasy especially, you're going to want to look out for this class. And I know it's going to be very difficult to really diagnose them from an early stage. But give them time to marinate in this league, and perhaps you will be slightly surprised, like pleasantly surprised by what they offer. That should just about do it for this segment. Coming up to end today's show, we finish with an IDP player profile of a player who had an injury-filled season last year, but I still believe is going to add a lot of value to one of the best defenses in the league. We'll be right back to talk about him after the break. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's last segment on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We are going to end today's show with an IDP player profile. This might be one of the last ones for a while as we get closer and closer to not only the fantasy football seasons but other sports being talked about more heavily on this show. And this is a guy who certainly is going to be an intriguing one to end off with, should this be our last ever IDP player profile. Mainly because when you talk about the San Francisco 49ers defense, and you talk about its depth, this guy either gets underappreciated, not talked about often enough, or his skill set isn't fully realized. Top that all off with an injury from last year, and he really goes into the season with a lot more questions than answers. Let's say that. But he certainly fills a role in a way that others on this team can't necessarily say. So without further ado, let's talk about the fantasy player profile of Dre Greenlaw. Let's get the graphic up real quickly. Now, we talked about Fred Warner and his IDP player profile, and most importantly, what he means to this team. And so, comparing him with Dre Greenlaw is kind of difficult because Dre Greenlaw brings a lot more physicality, a lot more, I wouldn't necessarily say energy, but he definitely brings a sense of dominance to this team. And it kind of offsets Warner's all-around kind of presence. I think they play off each other so well because Dre Greenlaw has that edge. Fred Warner is the one more focused on cohesion, but you need kind of a game wrecker like a Dre Greenlaw to truly covet the linebacker position, really understand the value he brings to this team. Without further ado, let's jump right into the stats of Dre Greenlaw. Now, in fantasy, he's accumulated over 453.1 fantasy points, 134.5 was his best season, 2022. Last year was kind of an unfortunate year for him. He had an Achilles tear early in the season, but he had 114 fantasy points, and his stats really kind of speak for themselves as I'm pulling them up here. He had 75 total tackles, 5 tackles for loss, 2 sacks, 4 QB hits, 4 passes defended. So overall, very balanced in terms of the output that he kind of brought to this team. Not necessarily Fred Warner numbers, not necessarily Nick Bosa numbers, but at the end of the day, these are numbers you can't ignore because this is a guy who is in a system that really covets overall depth and experience, and Dre Greenlaw brings that. And he also averaged a nice little 7.6 fantasy points per game. Now, let's kind of talk about the Achilles injury. This was during the Super Bowl, actually, not in the season, but he still has had his injury problems. And so, at the current moment, we don't necessarily know what Dre Greenlaw will be. Is he going to be the same player who we know and love? Is he going to be the same player who desires to get after the quarterback more than any other linebacker in this team? And so, that concern really comes into play when you think about how it will affect the San Francisco 49ers linebacker core. Because looking at the 3 top linebackers, Dre Greenlaw, Fred Warner, and Devondre Campbell, they each have their own assignment. Fred Warner, like we said, the all-around guy, the glue guy, the guy that keeps the whole operation ticking. Devondre Campbell, on the other hand, the strong side guy, is probably the guy who's going to stack blockers and open up a lot more avenues for not only the 49ers front 4 or 3 to really step into, but also allow for Dre Greenlaw to swoop in as well. Because Dre Greenlaw, out of all those 3, is the best pass rushing linebacker. And so, when I think about this Achilles injury, a lot of linebackers in this league are going to be coming back from this similar injury. Think about Jalen Phillips coming to mind. Bradley Chubb, even though it was an Achilles injury, coming to mind. A lot of linebackers have had this similar problem. And it's always going to be the question concerning them when they get back. Will they be the same player? Will they be coveted as someone who can still get to the ball? And with Dre Greenlaw, I feel like he has the best opportunity, but he's in a situation where he may have to concede a little bit of what he does. And what I mean by that is how he helps the team is going to come down to whether or not he's going to be in there early and often, and also in terms of situational football. When do you want Dre Greenlaw blitzing? can you really help him recover fully from this injury by having him on the field only in certain situations? Because when I look at this linebacker core, I don't necessarily see three guys who kind of are in a similar situation. I see three guys who fit together so well, are very so cohesive, and most importantly, I see other guys in this team who can help mitigate for the loss of one of their teammates. And so, you don't necessarily have to hurry back Dre Greenlaw from injury. I think that if Dre Greenlaw isn't ready, he isn't ready. If Dre Greenlaw can only play a certain amount, he can only play a certain amount. And it's all about finding how he can still be an integral part of that linebacker core. Because at the current moment, while a lot of people view him as the best, he certainly is someone who is going to get a lot more attention because of the stats he's able to put up. And so, at the end of the day, the bottom line is they're going to need Dre Greenlaw in certain situations to carry the torch for them. Because let's say the 49ers find themselves in a lot of third and short situations on the defensive side of the ball. Fred Warner's a fantastic athlete, but I think a lot of what he does is taken away when the offense has shorter yardage downs on the 49ers. And then Devondre Campbell is running out of space to eat up blockers. And so that's where Dre Greenlaw can come in and be really effective. He can come in on later downs, and that's what makes him so special. Because when I think about this 49ers defense, they are stellar, but they are injury prone. Look at the back line. Look at the back end too. Travarius Ward, Talanoa Hufanga also went down with injury. And so I think it's all about A, protecting the players and preserving what they can bring to the team, and B, just knowing what they're comfortable with in situational football. That's the key to unlocking all the players, but it's Dre Greenlaw especially, because coming back from such a harrowing injury where it was a non-contact thing, getting back into that mindset of being a more pass-rushing linebacker is going to be very difficult for him. And even though, like I say, the 49ers have so many weapons at their disposal on the defensive side of the ball, they don't necessarily worry too often about finding competent replacements. I think they still feel like the value that these injured players have coming back is really going to make them different. Because who knows? If every single 49ers defensive player was healthy in that last Super Bowl, I think they win the game. They even played fantastically well without them. But there's a difference between winning and losing. Let's talk about the 49ers as a whole team collective here. This is a team that's gone to, I believe, 3 of the past 5 NFC championship games. They've gone to 2 Super Bowls in that time span. If you consider what they did to get to those Super Bowls, it was by using system QBs in offense and getting the ball to the weapons, and the true story of the team was their defense. Last year was no different. I mean, Brock Purdy was excellent, but the defense was just the real, true, dominant force for them. And when you get to the Super Bowl, you're playing a really good defensive series, and all of a sudden Dre Greenlaw goes down. That's a bigger loss than people think. So this year, in terms of IEP, I really think that Dre Greenlaw is still going to be high up on this list of players that you might want to consider as sneaky options for your fantasy team. He's not going to be as healthy as other players, but he's just as important for what he adds to this 49ers team. Without him, we saw what happened last year. And who knows if it could have all come out different. That's how integral I believe Dre Greenlaw is, because that loss really was the difference between the 49ers winning and losing the Super Bowl. And that's the kind of player you are going to want on your IDP teams. But that should just about do it for today's show. Consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show as well. We also went over the tips a little bit. Leave them at the link gsmc.cloud. If you so choose, you can leave any questions, comments, or concerns. But that will just about do it for today's show on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys for tuning in yet again. We'll be back tomorrow with more.